Tao Han, Tianzhu Temple. With tangled firs and pines, the cave is hid. Around the western hill, a pathway creeps. One lofty crag is outlined on the sky. The temple towers are hung in airy deeps. On dawn-flushed cliff reclines the Buddha's home. Mid massed rocks, high balconies appear. The birds and monkeys' night-lone silence brings. The bell's deep booming chills the clouds with fear. The peak's green shadow tints the lake-born moon. The gorge wind's song, the torrent's music mars. My soul expands above the realms of air and hangs suspended with eternal stars. The morrow's dawn yet other prospect brings. I wake to see the eastern bounds long drawn. Waves stir the oily surface of the lake. As our pale seas, the darkness glows to morn. The old immortal's traces still are here. To us lies clear the pathway they impressed. And as my soul harks back to ages gone, I, darkly groping, feel them in my breast. So, this is a poem by Tao Han, and Tao Han is not a particularly famous poet. I decided to include a poem of his for reasons that I'll comment in a minute. But first, a little bit of biography. We only know of Tao Han that he lived in the 8th century. I think there is a stela inscription that he ordered to be composed in some province around the year 736. And I don't think there is much more information about him, really, at least not in English. And we know he has like 17 surviving poems, which are included in the complete Tang poetry collection. And that's it. Why do I include it here? Well, let's go on a little trip down memory lane. The first book I ever bought of Tang poetry was a book I bought around the year 2001-2. It's a Spanish translation in publishing house Bisor, and it's called, I don't remember the name now, but it's an anthology of Tang Dynasty poetry. And I have my doubts about this anthology. This was the first one I read and I liked it, but after learning a little bit of more about Tang poetry, I suspect this anthology is not a translation from the originals. The person in charge of it is a C.G. Moral, of whom I found information nowhere. In the preface that person writes, they never give any clue that they are translating directly from the Chinese. There are some weird other mistakes in the translation. The translation includes about 10, 11 poets. They generally are introduced with the Wei Jill's romanization of their Chinese name and others, including the Pinyin versions in parentheses. But in one, it's the other way around. In Bai Juji, who's the first one, I think, they start with the Pinyin instead of with the Wei Jill's. There are a few other weird things about the anthology. There's a poem by Wang Wei that is translated as Lady 11 with Roman numerals for 11, which is clearly a mistake for Lady She. There is a poem by a poet that is not a Tang Dynasty figure, by Liu, who was the last king of the Southern Tang Dynasty. But the Southern Tang Dynasty, as far as I know, was not related by blood with the real Tang Dynasty. They ruled a small state called Southern Tang or Yangnan during the 6 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, immediately after the fall of the Tang. And he didn't write Shi poetry. I think he mostly wrote Zi. And yeah, there are a couple of other weird things about this anthology, but otherwise it includes what you would expect. It has the typical poems by Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, Meng Haorang, maybe Wang Changling, Sun Shan, the typical figures. But it includes one poet, Tao Han, who, as I said, hardly appears anywhere else. I haven't seen any other translations of his. I've checked books. There is an obscure reference to him in Owens's The Hai Tang, but no poems, just a reference to him being a Hai Tang poet. That was appreciated. There is at least a couple of his poems that were included in a later anthology by Wang Angshi during the Song Dynasty. So, not a very important figure. It seems out of those 17 poems that remain of his, they are mostly devoted to frontier poetry, and that turns out to be the case also in the Spanish anthology I consulted, which includes two poems. One is the one I've just read about Tianzhu Mountain, and the other is a frontier poem. Where did the translator get these two poems from? I have no idea. I have managed to find a translation of the Mount Tianzhu poem in W.J.B. Fletcher's 19th century translation, Gems of Chinese Verse. But I am not aware that Fletcher translated any other of Tao Han's poems. So maybe from French, but I don't know. Anyway, it's a curiosity. I mean, this is the only poet in the Spanish anthology that is not a well-known Tang poet. Anyway, so this poem is dedicated to Mount Tianzhu. Lots of Chinese poems that we encountered in the 300 Tang Poems anthology and in other places are poems dedicated to mountains, which were numinous spaces where lots of Buddhist and Taoist temples were located. They were also places for hermits. They connected with the heavens, and they represented also a path of enlightenment and of expanding one's views metaphorically and literally. That is, Chinese poets thought that seeing from on high also expanded insight, like in the knowledge of ultimate reality and other stuff. What can we say about Tianzhu? I did some research. This is a mountain. The name means Heaven Pillar Mount, located in Anhui. So this means basically the center east of China, relatively close to the coast, the Eastern Sea, also called Wan Shan, One Mountain. And what else? It's a spectacular landscape, and it has indeed had Buddhist temples in it, and which are referenced in this poem, and also Taoist ones. So this is the typical landscape poet of a Tang scholar official, climbing a mountain and describing the beautiful landscape, the mountains and rivers, but also the temples and the sounds that can be appreciated in this place. And metrically, the poem is also a bit unusual. It's composed of pentasyllabic lines, which is pretty normal, but those pentasyllabic lines grouped in pairs form 5 stanzas, which is not typical, as you are well aware by now from having listened to previous poems. The typical Liu Xi or regulated poem is 4 stanzas, that is, 2 stanzas with 8 lines in total, 4 lines per stanza. That's a typical metric form of the regulated poem. You have the quatrain, which would be just 4 lines, heptasyllabic or pentasyllabic. Poems that were longer than 2 stanzas and subjected to the metrical and formal constraints of regulated poetry were usually called pailu, I think. So this poem is probably an example of a pailu, or even though it's clearly pentasyllabic, it might be written in the old style. It might be a gushi, but I have no way of knowing. I don't know enough Chinese to be able to tell you. So let's go to the poem. Instead of commenting couplet by couplet, we will comment stanza by stanza. So first stanza, with tangled firs and pines, the cave is hid. Around the western hill, a pathway creeps. One lofty crag is outlined on the sky. The temple towers are hung in airy deeps. So the first stanza introduces us to the Tianzhu Temple, not by showing us the temple, but by showing us the mountain and the landscape surrounding the temple. The temple is depicted as a cave or perhaps an entrance. A cave-like entrance leads to it, and it's hidden by a veil of firs and pines. So this is deep in nature. Green trees, evergreens, seem to block or hide away the entrance to the temple and perhaps to the mountain. But there is a path around the western hill, a pathway creeps, so there is a path that leads here, so there is some external symbol of human habitation. And the next couplet within the same stanza gives us two snapshots of views, which also emphasize the elevation, the fact that this temple is high in a mountain, high in the sky. One lofty crag is outlined on the sky, so you look up and you see a big mountain peak that goes up and up. And then you see the temple towers, so some part of the temple. And, we're high up in the mountains, so the temple towers are hung in airy deeps. They seem as if they were floating on nothing, on the clouds, on the air. Because you can imagine like the clouds hiding the base or parts of the temple, so that some of its pagodas or structures seem just to be floating on the void of the heavens. Second stanza. On dawn-flushed cliff reclines the Buddha's home. Mid massed rocks, high balconies appear. To birds and monkeys, night-lone silence brings. The bell's deep booming chills the clouds with fear. So the second stanza gives us more details. I would balk from calling it a zoom in, as in some poems, because we still aren't getting a lot of details. So the first couplet of the second stanza directly continues the previous couplet by depicting especially previous line 5 of the previous quarter of the previous stanza, which started with those floating towers. So now we get that on this cliff, flashed by dawn, illuminated by the dawn, the main building, the Buddha's home, is reclining on the cliff and illuminated by the dawn light. And amidst, in the middle of massive rocks, balconies appear. So again, you have the main structure on a cliff, maybe facing east because of the dawn-flushed cliff, and other structures that are also around the landscape. This is not a flat surface, so the pavilions, the buildings, have to be adapted to the rocky and mountainous landscape. The second part of this stanza brings in the sounds, not only the sights, but now the sounds. This is in nature, so to birds and monkeys, night lone silence brings. So monkeys and birds make noise all through the day. At night only do they become quiet. Another sound is the bell. So temples have these big bells that toll the hours, and they sound here. Their echo goes into the clouds, and the clouds, at least in Fletcher's translation, are personified as feeling afraid of this booming echo from the bells ringing at the different hours of the day. Okay, third stanza. Again, we get it. So here, the third stanza moves us more towards the subjective feelings of the poet. We still get in the first couplet of the third stanza description of the sounds and sights close to the mountain, but then we start getting the effect, the cumulative effect that all this landscape and the description that has gone before has on the poetic persona. So the peak's green shadow tints the lake-born moon, the gorgeous wind, the gorge wind's song, the torrent's music mars. And you have the green from the trees tinting a lake that is in the mountain. The lake probably includes the moon reflected on it, which is a symbol of Buddhist enlightenment. And there's a wind also through the gorge, and it's strong, and it's contrasting, juxtaposing, marring the sound of the torrent flowing. So, typical scenes, we've got a lake, we've got greenery, we've got a torrent feeding into the lake, making nice sounds, and we've got these visual elements The moon reflected, the shade or the colors of the trees also reflected in tinting the waters of the lake, and also the sounds of the wind and the waters. All this affects the poetic persona. My soul expands above the realms of air and hangs suspended with eternal stars. So the soul of the poet is moved by these sights, and like a disembodied, spiritual, unattached wanderer, separating itself from the red dust of the world, floats up and reaches the stars. Fourth stanza. The morrow's dawn yet other prospect brings. I wake to see the eastern bounds long drawn. Waves stir in the oily surface of the lake. As o'er pale seas, the darkness glows to morn. So we might imagine there's a break between stanza 3 and 4. So the poet has arrived at the monastic complex, he sleeps there, and the next day, the next morning, he gains new sights. So he looks, he wakes, he sees the eastern bounds long drawn. That is, he looks to the east, and he sees the eastern bounds, I imagine the rocky boundaries of the mountain extending, long drawn. Now waves are seen in the lake, that was mentioned in the previous stanza. So there's a little bit of wind, so you can see the little waves on a dark, oily water. And from the height of this mountain, you can probably see the East China Sea, so that's why there's a reference. As o'er pale seas, the darkness glows to morn. The sun is rising in the east, where the East Sea is. So you can, as it's rising, you can see the darkness of the water and the sky dissipating, and glorious sunshine illuminating the sea. Finally, the fifth stanza. Usually in a poem like this, and in traditional Chinese poetry, the last poem synthesizes the emotions that the poem has, and the views here have generated in the poet. But we already had this in stanza 3. We have a little bit of it now in the last stanza, but also a connection with dreams of transcendence associated with Taoist immortals. You know, lots of Taoists, as we mentioned in previous poems, went to the mountains, did ascetic practices there, and according to traditional law, they managed to achieve immortality and transcend the world. So it's a curious fact that the last stanza evokes Taoism when the previous stanzas and images were more clearly connected with a Buddhist temple, which is the one that gives its name to the poem. The title of the poem clearly includes the character she for Buddhist temple. The old immortals' traces still are here. To us lies clear the pathway they impressed. And as my soul harks back to ages gone, I darkly groping feel them in my breast. So the traces of the immortals remain, maybe not literal traces, but their teachings, their model of how to transcend the world. And the poet is in that mood. His soul is not only elevated into the stars, it's going back in time thinking about these immortals from the past, people like Ko and Shu, students of Taoism who were supposed to retire from the world and who lived in this temple or close to this temple in this mountain. And he feels in his breast, in his heart, these examples from the past. So overall, quite an interesting landscape mountain poem from a not very well-known poet.